Hi, everyone. My name is Laura DiStefano. I am Director of Communications at the National Academy of Medicine. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on the special publication that was just released, titled The State of the U.S. Biomedical and Health Research Enterprise, Strategies for Achieving a Healthier America. You can now download a copy of the report and other supporting materials at nam.edu/biomedicalresearch. For those of you not familiar with the National Academy of Medicine, we are one of 3 academies that make up the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which are private, nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. I'll now give a brief overview of what to expect for this webinar. It is scheduled to last for 1 hour and 45 minutes. We will begin with opening remarks, followed by a presentation summarizing the report, and then a panel discussion featuring national leaders in biomedical research. Then we'll open it up for questions. Please enter your questions anytime for the panelists in the Q&A box in Zoom. The slides presented today and a recording of the webinar will be available next week at nam.edu/biomedicalresearch. And now let me turn it over to Dr. Victor Dzau, President of the National Academy of Medicine, to provide a few welcoming remarks. Dr. Dzau?
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this really important release of our publication. As you heard, I'm Victor Dzau, President of the National Academy of Medicine in the United States. And, I'm so glad to be with you virtually for this launch. The publication from the National Academy of Medicine is called The State of U.S. Biomedical and Health Research Enterprise, Strategies for Achieving a Healthier America. That's exactly what we want to do, is to achieve a healthy America. This publication is the culmination of a year's worth of work at the NAM by leaders, as you hear, from biomedical research, health and medicine, driven in large part by the leadership of my good friend, Dr. L. Rees. So, a little history. Back in 2022, the NAM held its annual meeting with a scientific program centered on, quote, revolutionizing the biomedical and health sciences. That meeting discussed really many issues, both challenges and opportunities for transforming the biomedical scientific enterprise. We heard from experts across a range of sectors: philanthropy, federal agencies, government, universities, and scientific journals. And people shared insights on how to drive transformation and address the many challenges that face America's research enterprise. It was really an important meeting, and there was clear agreement that the enterprise needs another recharge, if you will, to really being able to address the complex challenges that we're all facing. So last year, we're lucky to have Dr. L. Rees, who's Dean Emeritus of the University of Maryland School of Medicine, join the NAM as a scholar in residence. So L and I agreed that the NAM should build on the momentum of the 2022 annual meeting and undertake a more systematic analysis of the current U.S. standing in biomedical science, research, and technology. It's first of its kind. In 2010, Norm Augustine released a seminal report on science, engineering, and it was a powerful evaluation of that time U.S. competitiveness across science and engineering, and prompted legislative actions to reshape the STEM ecosystem. So Al and I realized that it's time for one on biomedical research. And with so many things going on in technology, geopolitics, and of course, the biomedical research ecosystem, it's time for a new strategic vision. So together, we decided to establish a group of distinguished leaders, scientists, to really together author this special publication aiming to say, where are we in the biomedical enterprise? How are we impacting health outcomes? What are our priorities for further action? And this author group that you're going to hear from use both quantitative and qualitative analysis to evaluate the current state. They also interviewed experts, including former NIH Director Francis Collins, former Senator Roy Blunt, former Director of the National Academy of Medicine, Harvey Feinberg, former President and Director of the NIH Foundation, Maria Ferrer, and many, many others across the many different sectors. So what you hear today is a comprehensive, up-to-date assessment of the enterprise, its achievement, and, shall we say, its shortcomings, the challenges, and the proposals, priorities to be undertaken by the government, the private sector, and scientific community. So I'm very excited to have them tell you about the issues of their findings, the need for strategic vision, proposal of creation new model of financing and funding, the importance of closing the gap between innovation and the access for those in need, the equity issue, the workforce, and of course, how to bring together the entire discipline. So I'm going to turn to Al and select members of the author group to give you an overview. After that, you will hear from, I'll come back, and you'll hear reactions from major leaders in the field. And I'll introduce them very shortly afterwards, and they will give you their reaction, their insights, their support, and their critique of the report. And I think this is going to be a phenomenal day of talking about the science of the United States, biomedical science. So Al, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Dzau. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us online today. I'm delighted to share with you the approach and the methodology that our committee used to evaluate how well prepared our current U.S. biomedical research enterprise is in order to address current and future challenges facing the health of our nation. We use publicly available data to examine inputs and outputs to and from the enterprise, which included funding and investments, as well as disease trends. Next slide, please. We also could go to the slide, next one, please. One more. Thank you. We also examined global trends, including what peer nations are investing in their research and development and in their biomedical research workforce development. We also looked at how peer nations are prioritizing their investments. In addition, we interviewed experts in government, foundations, and private sector venture capital. The insights we obtained from these interviews helped us to interpret our analyses of the data spanning over 20 years. We then identified a recommended series of priority areas, which we will share with you momentarily. Next slide, please. We began our work from the beginning of the modern-day U.S. biomedical research enterprise. As many of you may recall, President Franklin Roosevelt gave the charge to Dr. Vannevar Bush, who at the time led the Office of Scientific Research and Development. The charge was to explore the utility of a peacetime research and development enterprise similar to the R&D role that he led during World War II. Vannevar Bush's strategic vision that he developed for the U.S. biomedical research enterprise was codified in his treatise shown on this slide and titled Science, the Endless Frontier. In that document, Bush called for the expansion of government support for science. This effort subsequently led to the creation of the National Science Foundation. And since that time, the US federal government has been the primary funder of discovery research and has invested heavily in this effort. The US biomedical research enterprise quickly grew to become the global leader. Next slide, please. Although we did not do an exhaustive analysis of all disease trends, we chose several exemplar health challenges and examined the incidence, prevalence, and mortality over time. For example, we chose cancer as a whole, cardiovascular disease, HIV/AIDS, and others. As this slide will show, we found that in general, biomedical research has led to great improvement in human health. But more specifically, overall cancer incidence and mortality have improved, in large measure due to the research in prevention, screening, and improved diagnostics and treatments. Likewise, HIV incidence and mortality have dramatically declined once again due to research in prevention, screening, diagnostics, and treatments. Next slide, please. With regard to cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, we found that overall there was improvement. However, what we also found was that the gains that were made have recently been eroded. Hence, the graph will reflect a flattening in recent years. Next slide, please. In addition to the erosion of the gains made in cardiovascular disease, we also saw troubling trends on the rise in many areas, and this slide will demonstrate a couple of them. On the left side of the slide, you'll see that the US life expectancy has fallen in the last 2 decades. You'll see on the right side that the US maternal mortality rates have risen and currently are at the highest among wealthy nations and are unacceptably high overall. In addition, there are significant disparities existing among subgroups in the United States. Next slide, please. There are other health challenges the nation is facing, some of which are depicted on this slide. For example, the upper left portion of the slide, you'll see that an aging baby boomer population exists, and an increasing number of these are affected by dementias, and including Alzheimer's disease. There's also increasing drug overdose deaths and so-called deaths of despair, as shown on the right upper corner of the slide. The global obesity epidemic, that has been growing for decades and is now projected it's now projected to affect half of the US population within the next 6 years. In addition, partly due to the obesity epidemic, diabetes incidence is rising concomitantly. And this is particularly seen in regions of the country that are seen to be food deserts, healthcare deserts, and are generally poor. So overall, these are concerning health challenges that our nation is facing. Next slide, please. Simultaneously with these health challenges, the US remains the highest spender in absolute dollars on biomedical research, and that is shown on the left side of the slide with the various countries listed accordingly. However, it should be noted that other countries are invested aggressively and heavily. In fact, some countries have invested significantly higher proportions of their GDP compared to the US, and that is shown on the right side of the slide with the names of these countries indicated accordingly. These are very important trends in health challenges and biomedical research investments. We therefore must watch these trends very carefully relative to impact and outcomes. Next slide, please. Federal investment in biomedical research, without question, has been broad and sustained. However, what we have observed is the larger the enterprise grows, the less coordinated it has become. Funding levels have grown rapidly over the past 75 years, but they have begun to level off, due in large measure to many competing spending priorities for the federal government. So although many researchers may hope for the NIH doubling of 20 years ago to occur again, in reality, that's unlikely to occur. Therefore, we have considered other approaches, which we will share with you momentarily. Next slide, please. Now let's turn our attention to the biomedical research workforce. This is our knowledge capital. This workforce is highly specialized and critical for the continued success of the research enterprise, critical for the US leadership, and critical for the global economy. Despite this essential role of the workforce, we're just not seeing the growth necessary to sustain the future. This slide shows on the left the flattening of the physician-scientist trend line, and on the right, the flattening of the postdoctoral fellows trend line. Many factors are contributing to this workforce challenge. Some are specific to the research enterprise, and some are at the level of national policy. Next slide, please. A further analysis will reveal that the biomedical research enterprise workforce is composed of two existing pathways. One is domestic and the other is international. But both pathways are being challenged. On the one hand, we need more US students pursuing science pathways and options. On the other hand, it is well known that at many research-intensive academic institutions, including my own, most postdoctoral fellows are international and experience uncertainty in furthering their training in the US due to a variety of restrictive policies. These are just some of the challenges that impact both pathways to our workforce. Next slide, please. The report that we have assembled highlights clear opportunities, as shown on this slide, for the US biomedical research to address, and to do so in order to maximize its potential. They're clearly outlined on this slide. The US biomedical research has been highly successful, and we believe from our study that this success trajectory can continue. However, it's important that we proactively make a shift in how the enterprise operates. This will position it for a more robust and successful future, thus impacting the health of everyone, everywhere. Next slide, please. I wish to summarize our results as follows. We found that overall, the biomedical research enterprise has greatly improved human health. However, due to changes in health and disease and other factors, the gains that we have seen are either being eroded or in some cases have never benefited everyone, everywhere. Secondly, federal funding of biomedical research has been extraordinary and must continue. However, federal funding alone cannot sustain the growth trajectory that we have seen in the past and that we need in the future. Number three, our knowledge capital, which is our research workforce, is the very best in the world. However, training mechanisms have not evolved and career pathways have become challenged. Therefore, we must reconfigure how we can optimize the impact and the outcomes of the biomedical research enterprise. We have identified 5 key priority areas that we believe are essential to reinvigorate and to enhance the robust nature of our biomedical research enterprise for successful longevity and to ensure a healthy America for everyone, everywhere. Now, I'll now ask my colleagues, Dr. Elias Zerhouni, Dr. N. Kurth, and Dr. Sudip Parikh, in that order, to take you through these priority areas that we believe are so critical as we go forward. Dr. Zerhouni.
Thank you, Al. Can I have the next slide? I think that based on the comments of Victor and Al, it is quite obvious that the enterprise has progressed, but has become more complex and has facing even more complex challenges. And the nature of biomedical research has also changed to the point where it's become multidisciplinary in nature within an ecosystem that is actually more complex than it's ever been, but yet at the same time more promising than it's ever been. So if you look on the left side, the funding primarily at the top comes from the federal government. And in academia uses that funding in conjunction with philanthropic support to actually support and create the workforce we're talking about. And then it's related to venture capital and industry that make these ideas and these discoveries become real products that will benefit the population. Now, the workforce obviously emerges from all these activities of researching and training the researchers of the future. And then at the same time, how do we ensure that the discovery pipeline remains efficient to address the issues that Al was raising as new issues, emerging issues that we need to tackle? At the same time, it is very, very true that translation is difficult. There is a valley of death that is known to everyone. And so the group thought about how to coordinate, how to best use the resources that we have. Next slide. Now, we looked at nations around the world, and it's very clear that unlike other nations, America does not have a mechanism of looking transversely across all fields of sciences that are relevant to biomedical research, such as computational sciences, artificial intelligence, physical sciences, not just biomedical, pure biomedical research areas, and trying to combine those in advances that are coordinated, that are synergistic, and that show, in fact, to the leadership of the country where the direction is, not over 1 year or 2 years, but over a mid and long term. And that's what we saw in China with the 2025 plan that has been publicized, where there is a medium and long-term plan for the development of science and technology, taking into account not just biomedical research or the pharmaceutical industry, but all components, all inputs necessary to succeed. Europe has also a program called Horizon Europe, which is a 7-year plan with about $90 billion or billion euros of funding, categorizing what needs to happen, where are the synergies, where are the collaborations between the private sector and the public sector that will lead to the greatest benefit of the biomedical and health enterprises. So Singapore, a smaller country, also has that mechanism. We do not. So next slide. What our first recommendation is essentially we need a national strategy. We cannot go year by year by year with funding that is unpredictable, really, and 14 to 20 different agencies investing, without any coordination or synergy between them. And so our number one recommendation is that an advisory body be created by the president and Congress to galvanize that sort of leadership, of integrated leadership, not just biomedical researchers, but the entire ecosystem of research needs to be involved here. And we need to have a national strategic vision that goes beyond 1 or 2 years. Science is a long-term enterprise. It's also endless as a frontier. And we really need to plan on longer terms, longer periods of time than we do today. And then the strategic vision is going to be necessary to address the fragmentation, but also to increase the efficiency of our research engines and to coordinate that and create synergies that we do not have today, while at the same time setting priorities that are relevant to the health of the American people. And so next slide, next slide. And so what we believe is important is that a national advisory body accountable to the people needs to be thought through, established in some fashion, and that will basically set mid and long-term vision that allows for strategic planning of funding, inform Congress about the need for funding over what period of time, in what amounts for all areas of science, creates mechanisms of forced collaboration almost between the different areas of sciences that are relevant today to biomedical research. Workforce development, as Al said, is our Achilles heel. Fundamentally, with the progress of other countries, the advantage that we have over many decades of being the attractor of the greatest talent in the world is no longer as strong as it used to be, and our internal policies in many ways are preventing the flow of the best talent in the world to come to the United States to support the economy that we have and the ability that we expect to have a synergy and a collaboration in the ecosystem that produces real results over time. So that's for the and then the infrastructure to achieve all of this, and the governance and the policies underneath all of that need to be thought through. It's not an easy task, but it is a task that the nation needs. And then we need to identify and coordinate opportunities for the efficiencies and the targeted efforts that we need to make. But underneath all of that, our group feels that there is still much to do in discovery and fundamental understanding of biology. And so we need to continue to enable discovery and curiosity-driven research, not fall into the trap of central planning, which is what other countries have done and failed at. We need to maintain that ability for many of our researchers to explore the unknown with no expectation of results. That's that curiosity-driven research, which has truly served us very well, while at the same time realizing that not everything can be achieved with that kind of research, but large-scale team science and convergence between fields of science, physical sciences, computational sciences, and medical sciences need to come together, because no single group today can truly pierce the complexities of biological systems as we have discovered them over the past 2 decades. And so this is truly the basis, if you will, of our first recommendation. And the next slide, if you could, is to streamline and coordinate this impactful funding that we're talking about, and realize that, in fact, we're lucky. We're lucky. We have the first venture capital system in the world that supports new enterprises. The industry is very vibrant and commits a tremendous amount of resources. The government continues to support fundamental research and academia, and philanthropy has grown. And all of those need to come together and have barriers removed between these different areas of the ecosystem. Now, let's remember that the NIH appropriations, although they have increased in absolute number, in inflation-corrected numbers, they have decreased since 2005. And when you look at the philanthropy has significantly increased. How do we take advantage of this momentum, if you will, that serves different aspects of the ecosystem? Now, last but not least, the costs of translation, next slide, remain high. All of us who've been involved in combining these forces to achieve products that really impact the health trajectory of the population realize that despite all of the resources, the cost of doing translation has increased. Next slide. And so because of that, the return on investments are in decline, in fact, in the pharmaceutical industry at large. The pandemic did help and accelerated industry productivity when it came to develop a vaccine. It was done in record time. So it shows that it can be done. And the costs and length of time to develop drugs have unfortunately continued to increase. And you see at the bottom the costs that are being reported to be $2 billion, $2.5 billion per significant drug. That counts, in fact, the failures that an R&D organization will face before they can develop a successful product. Now, reducing the number of failures, accelerating the time by which we can explore different areas of disease biology will be very effective. But policies underneath this translation are also important. For example, the 1983 Orphan Drug Act, which came at a time when there was no interest and no co-investments for rare diseases, has really successfully accelerated translation, leading to 575 orphan drugs approved thus far, and having a positive impact for millions of patients with rare diseases. So it can be done, and this is what we recommend that we should do. So next slide. So our conclusion is that we need mechanisms to better leverage available resources and establish collaborative funding solutions, much more than what we currently do. So our actions are, let's pool and allocate shared investments from government, private sector, and philanthropy, and leverage new funding mechanisms to address the funding valley of death, which we'll all know is what eventually makes discoveries non-translationable. So with that, I'd like to introduce Anne Karth, our committee member that will also cover our other priorities. And I'll leave it to you, Anne.
Thanks, Elias. Appreciate it. Next slide, please. So our report calls out a tremendous opportunity to accelerate achievement of health equity. And really, as Al laid out at the beginning, the urgency of doing so in a time of declining life expectancy, unrealized health span, deaths of despair, persistent health disparities, emerging pandemics, and the growing impact of climate change on health. For nearly any condition or disease you can name, unconscionable disparities persist. And here we show cancer rate and mortality inequities. But there are similar patterns that we saw and put forward around HIV, cardiovascular disease, asthma, et cetera. Next slide, please. And there remain differences in health outcomes by sex and gender, including for maternal mortality, which should be exceedingly rare, as is the case in the Netherlands, as we show here. Yet we have an order of magnitude higher maternal mortality rate in the US. In fact, I worked in New York last week. We reviewed maternal mortality in New York and found a 9-fold differential for some groups, 2 to 3 times higher for Black birthing mothers and women in the US. So these numbers must change. We cannot leave behind half our population, and investing in more women's research will have substantial economic benefit. Next slide, please. The undeniable fruits of the US biomedical research enterprise have not reached all populations equally, as we've been stressing, and cannot be delivered where there are healthcare workforce and health service shortages, as we outline here. Next slide, please. And being able to deliver on science for all Americans and to ensure populations take up and effectively use the vaccines, drugs, devices, and health interventions that we create also requires trust in the science that creates them. And we all know that there's the trust levels for many professional groups has really declined in recent years, but it remains higher for medical scientists and for health professionals. This is something to build upon. Nonetheless, we also must build science literacy, as well as improve the use of evidence-based science communications to help regain that crucial balance of trust. Next slide, please. Our report makes a clarion call to action to center equity as a focus explicitly of the research enterprise outcome, since equity is a public good that supports not only health, but also a stronger economy. Equity has not been an explicit goal of the research enterprise to date as such, and so this shift to center it is not only overdue, but will benefit all Americans. So recommendation 3 here, our research must address social determinants of health, support increased trust in science and communication, leverage implementation science to deliver it to those who need it where it exists, particularly in that last mile that we've mentioned, increase community engagement and bidirectional dialogue, a sort of citizen science to enrich the work that's being done. The research workforce must be diversified. Many studies show that doing so supports greater patient participation in care, adherence to treatment, satisfaction, and reach, as well as creative science and higher impact publications. The biomedical research enterprise itself must be diversified, including in the data used, particularly as these data feed the AI systems and tools we increasingly rely upon. For recommendation 3.2, the health equity valley of death between research outputs and improved health outcomes of all Americans must be attended to. As just one recent example, the incredible accomplishment of COVID mRNA vaccines would not have been possible without long-term basic science investments, as well as accelerated team science to create and manufacture. And yet all of that would have been for naught if those vaccines couldn't have been distributed to the people who would benefit from their protection. All people and communities should be able to access the fruits of the amazing research enterprise we have in the United States. To do so, we must address health access barriers, reduce the digital divide to improve community care, and finally, eliminate discrimination, racism, sexism, and other practices in order to reduce morbidity and mortality for every American, and to unleash fully the advances brought forward by the medical research enterprise now and into the future. To you, Sudip.
Thanks, Ann, and good afternoon, everybody. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'll be speaking on recommendations 4 and 5. Now, suggesting that the federal government ought to coordinate better is a little bit like recommending to my kids that they ought to eat more vegetables. Everybody knows it's a good idea, but nobody is willing or is able to put their political capital on line to make it happen. And it's as true for parents trying to get their kids to eat their vegetables as it is for the federal government trying to get an all-of-government approach to solving problems. But here's the thing. For advancing U.S. biomedical research and, most importantly, improving the lives of Americans, better coordination is a bedrock action. It has to happen. And so on this slide, you see a representation of the various government research agencies studying just one complex condition, the causes of obesity. And complex chronic diseases involve many biological systems, and studying these diseases requires many approaches. We know that as scientists. Critically, the complexity should lie in the disease and not in the funding source. Siloed funding and research agendas are hurting the cause. It's hard enough for a scientist to understand the complexity of the disease. They shouldn't also have to understand the equally complex and Byzantine nature of the federal government. They shouldn't have to know all these acronyms of every federal agency and every federal program. And you see that here in terms of we need to make sure that we have developed a more streamlined and coordinated approach. Let's go to the next slide, please. On the next slide, you're going to see us making the point that it goes even beyond the traditional biomedical research funding agencies that were on the last slide and encompasses a much wider range of adjacent agencies. For example, the Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, the Department of Education, the FDA, the CDC, and a whole lot more. And if we're truly going to get convergent science, this is the ability of bringing to bear the physical sciences and the behavioral sciences on biomedical research problems and challenges, we're going to have to coordinate the federal government so that it can better interact with industry, philanthropy, academia, and startups. These interactions are beginning through great leadership at boundary-spanning organizations like the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, or the FNIH, and it's exemplified by projects like Operation Warp Speed, the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, and the ARPA-H Investor Catalyst Hub. And when you think about it, government and industry have different cultures on different timelines, different funding, and a whole host of other things. And these structures that we've built to encourage convergence are building the gear systems between the varying cultures. And they're just getting started. And we got to do more because we've seen that when you do it, you get efficiencies, you minimize redundancies, and you actually see results. Let's go to the next slide, please. So to name the recommended actions, first, require and facilitate necessary and essential coordination across agencies to enable the use of convergent science. This is so important that we've outlined it as a separate recommendation to have that coordination. Second, promote and ensure the use of convergent science in all federally funded projects. All right, now I'm going to turn to recommendation number 5. Next slide, please. So here, next slide. Here we're going to talk about building a 21st century workforce for biomedical research. Now, I don't think anybody disputes that if we're going to produce effective therapies, drugs, and diagnostics, and again, even more importantly, if we're going to improve the health of all Americans, we have got to attract the smartest, most dedicated people into the enterprise in every sector, every discipline, and every domain. The challenge is that structural compensation, education, and training issues have reached a tipping point. And this applies regardless of the pathway, 2 of which are represented on this slide, that you take into biomedical research. Now, each path faces unique challenges, and this is by no means meant to be exhaustive. And we recognize that there are many paths into biomedical research, including those that don't require advanced degrees. But when you look at these 2 paths, if you come in through the K-12 STEM education pathway here in America, and you go to an undergraduate research institution or an undergraduate institution, and then you go to another institution to get an advanced degree, then you go to a postdoctoral scholarship. This is a very lengthy pathway, and it's very hard for someone like me to recommend to a first-generation student whose family may be counting on them to help provide support. It's very hard for me to recommend to them that they should go down this pathway when there are other pathways to being able to support their families and being able to help realize the American dream for their families. That is a challenge until just a few stats would show you that compensation and benefits for entering biomedical research, they've got to be raised to parity with similar positions, or we're going to risk losing qualified applicants. Postdoctoral positions today regularly pay $15,000 less than comparative positions. Postdoctoral positions, depending on the source of funding, can vary in access to benefits as well. That's hard to recommend to a first-generation student. If you come in through the second pathway, the international pathway, international students, scientists, and scholars have contributed significantly to the U.S. biomedical research enterprise. I think that if anything, that's understating it. In 2019, more than 4,000 individuals holding temporary visas in the U.S. were awarded bachelor's degrees in biological sciences, and more than 2,500 were awarded master's degrees, and almost 2,000 were awarded doctoral degrees. And many of these graduates remain in the country for the rest of their professional careers. We've got to ensure that the U.S. remains a welcoming and accessible country for international scholars to learn, live, and work. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so we have a list of recommendations related to this. The first is to reinforce K-12 STEM education. We see this in anything related to the sciences. We know that as a country, we are having challenges in K-12 STEM education. We're not doing the job we need to do compared to our competitors internationally. Second, removing the barriers that are preventing the integration of international students. We've got to make sure that we have that we have significantly shortened the duration of the immigration process. We need to expand and we need to make sure that we are expanding the pool of temporary visas and also other pathways for international students. We've got to expand early stage investigator funding opportunities, especially for physician scientists. We know that they have challenges. Reclassifying postdoctoral scholars as employees to remove unpredictability. When the postdoctoral stage is lasting 5, 6, 7 years, it's hard to justify it being an apprenticeship. We've got to support physician scientists training, education, and professional work. And lastly, we've got to prioritize the recruitment and retention of specialist workforce through new funding modalities, expanding student loan forgiveness, and providing more career development awards. If we don't do this, then over time, we are not going to be attracting the best, the brightest into the biomedical research workforce. And at the end of the day, whether they go into academia, whether they go into industry, whether they go into philanthropy, whatever sector they go into, we need them. All those are wonderful sectors to be in. We're going to need the workforce to support all of them. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Al.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all my colleagues for walking us through the five recommended priorities. So we have shared with you our findings in general, including successes, opportunities, and as you've heard, identified priorities. To summarize, the U.S. biomedical research enterprise is a national treasure, and thus far has greatly improved human health overall. Next slide, please. Thank you. We believe that the enterprise has even greater potential, but it must be reimagined and reconfigured now in order to achieve the optimal outcomes that we want for everyone. We have laid out a roadmap that can ensure successful longevity for the U.S. biomedical research through these 5 priorities or 5 priority areas that we've described. And to summarize them briefly, we could simply focus on them as assemble an advisory body to set a national strategic vision, streamline and coordinate funding across sectors, prioritize and focus on health equity, improve federal coordination and apply broadly convergent science, and develop a future-ready workforce. Implementing these priorities, we strongly believe, will enable us to use our collective resources most effectively and strategically, and will advance our enterprise to the next level of excellence and most importantly, will benefit everyone, everywhere in this nation. Thank you very much. And now I turn the program back to Dr. Dzau.
Well, I have to give you a thunderous applause for this great presentation. But more importantly, it's what the report findings and priorities are that really is, to me, resonates so well with me. Now we have a chance to hear from the leaders of biomedical research and see their reaction. So let me first introduce this distinguished panel of leaders. They include Dr. Monica Boccinelli, Director of NIH. Before this position, she was Director of National Cancer Institute, and of course worked as a professor and a surgeon at the forefront of clinical oncology. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Monica, a good friend who I've known for a long time. Welcome, Monica. Second is Dr. Kimrin Rathmel, who's Director of National Cancer Institute. She previously served as Physician-in-Chief and Chair of Department of Medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, another amazing physician scientist. So welcome, Kimrin. And third is Dr. John Reed, Executive Vice President of Innovative Medicine and Research and Development at Johnson & Johnson. He has served in executive leadership positions at Sanofi and Roche, as well as CEO of Sanford Burnham Medical Research Institute, now known as Sanford Burnham Presby. So finally, and certainly not the least, Dr. Robert Cohn, Distinguished Policy and Pacific Leadership Fellow at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. And of course, but Bob's done so much to science as the former president and CEO of Kavli Foundation and a co-founder of Science Philanthropy Alliance. So welcome, John, and welcome, Bob. So, you know, it's obvious to you that we have asked the leaders in biomedical research, leaders in the largest funding agency in the world in biomedical science, leaders in industry, particularly R&D, and of course, leader in philanthropy, and all of them are scientists by their own right. So we got the right panel. So I'm going to ask everyone to react to the first question. You can take 1 or 2 minutes. The question is, well, what do you think? What do you think about this publication? What are the things that you like? What are the things that you didn't like? What would you highlight and what's missing? So let me go first with Monica then. We just go through everyone according to that sequence. Then I have lots of questions to ask you. Monica, begin with you.
Well, thank you so much, Victor, and to the entire team who put together this amazing report. And I just have to say, everything within it resonates so powerfully with me. I will say that NIH might be the largest funder of biomedical research. However, we will never succeed. We cannot succeed without playing a role, an effective role within a much broader ecosystem that delivers health to people. It's really critical. And many of the things outlined in this report provide detail, effective, wonderful recommendations for what we do at NIH and how it can fit in within a larger ecosystem. Finally, I'll say that if you asked me what our 2 greatest challenges are, truly, it's not finding the talent, it's not scientific innovation, it's really 2 things. First of all, the goal is health, right? The goal is health for all people. And the 2 things that I think are our biggest challenges is, first and foremost, in the United States, dealing with the US healthcare system and how it operates. And then number 2, getting the coordination together across all of the partners that can influence how we can bring discovery to the US healthcare system to promote health for everyone. So thank you for this wonderful report. There'll be many, many details that we dive into as time goes
Yes.
on. I'm really thrilled with the recommendations.
Well, thank you for your stamp of approval. It means a lot to us. The whole purpose of doing this, in fact, is to enable the whole research enterprise and leadership like yours to move forward with the right steps, right direction. So let me turn to Kimran. Kimran, what are your thoughts?
Great. Yes, thank you. And I'll echo thanks for the foresight to put this together, because this is really important. I think I'll first say that I agree, as usual, with what Monica said, but I'll add that number one, this is really timely. It's also essential, and I think that the bringing it to action would be really meaningful and could really make a big difference for a lot of the things that we do. Speaking from the cancer space, this resonates really well because we've, first, I'll start with the Reignited Cancer Moonshot, which is this all-of-government approach working across the Cancer Cabinet, and we have taken that very seriously. And so the opportunities that come from partnerships across the government are really, really powerful. So what you articulate, being able to do more, we have great programs with the VA today that didn't used to exist, and with the Department of Energy, which accelerate all of the incredible work that we couldn't do in AI without those kinds of things. So moving beyond that to private sector, even more than we do today, to me, that's really powerful. I think I'll also say, again, it speaks to some of the things that we've really been trying to do. For example, in the workforce space, we don't have enough funding to fund all of the incredible talent that is out there. And so partnered with the American Cancer Society, who have a Catalyst program that's helping to, pick up some of our younger talent. We just want more people in the cancer research workforce. And so that there's no pride in whether it's ours or theirs. We just want them all out there. So I think these kinds of really intentional interactions can go a long way. So I'll stop there, but I think it all resonated very well with me.
Thank you. Boy, nothing but just, you like it. So I'm sure there are some areas that we can talk about where we can improve, or you agree or disagree. But let me turn to John.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And thanks for having the opportunity for me representing Johnson & Johnson to speak. Approximately 2/3 of all the biomedical research funding in the United States actually comes from for-profit companies. And in fact, a recent study indicated that on a global basis, just looking at pharmaceuticals, setting aside med device and diagnostics, the industry invests approximately $270 billion a year in biomedical research. I found all of the points of the proposal to be spot on, and I probably focus my comments on workforce, opportunities for public-private partnerships, collaborative funding, and then fostering the medical innovation ecosystem. On workforce, certainly companies like Johnson & Johnson are entirely dependent on the workforce coming from our great academic institutions that train the next generation of scientists, et cetera, to lead the work in our laboratories. That training gives them the foundational knowledge that then we can train to further specialize in drug discovery, development, et cetera, but it's critical. And so I think the recommendations around both the internal and the external international track are very spot on. I'm a big fan of Thomas Friedman's suggestion in The World is Flat, that every PhD who graduates from a US institution with a degree in one of the STEM areas should be handed a green card along with their diploma. We need to be able to keep these very talented scientists and engineers here. And I would note, if you look at Nobel laureates, the United States, of course, is the world's leader. Since World War II, more than half of our US Nobel laureates were foreign born. So bringing that talent here, keeping it here is critical. With the homegrown tracks, I do applaud the call for investing in physician scientists, where we have medically trained people also becoming rigorous scientists. I certainly was a beneficiary of the NIH Medical Scientist Training Program. But I think it may be time to think of some more combined degree opportunities. And I would say computer science, AI, married with medicine or scientific disciplines relative to life sciences would be a great initiative for us to think about. At the college level, and in terms of encouraging STEM, there's a lot of popular discussion around student loan forgiveness. What about a program where if you go into a STEM area for your major, your loan is forgiven or half of it's forgiven or something? I think we could do things to create incentives that more of our bright college students are taking a STEM track rather than preparing themselves for Wall Street. And then at the high school level, having worked for European-based pharmaceutical companies, Roche in Switzerland, Sanofi in France, and now J&J with a large European footprint, I've seen the power of the apprentice programs that we have there, where starting in 10th grade, students can elect to go a vocational track where they're trained to work in laboratories or on manufacturing floors, and where they spend their mornings in didactic and laboratory training, and then their afternoons actually working in the lab environment as apprentices. That would be a great boon. And I have to tell you, at companies like J&J, we fund tens of thousands of high school degreed employees in our manufacturing facilities, and we can't get enough of them. So I'd highly encourage those types of workforce development. On collaborative funding, I think there's definitely an opportunity to take that to the next level. There are a lot of public-private partnerships focused on disease biology, but I think maybe an opportunity would be more on enabling technologies that make the process of discovering, designing, and developing new therapies faster and more cost-effective. Certainly AI could play a role in all that, but it also might be things like developing the next generation of platforms for innovative small molecule discovery, biologics, antibody engineering, gene, genomic therapies, et cetera. Things like this would resonate, I think, across the industry, as well as things like in the clinical environment, digital endpoints, where we can continuously remotely monitor symptoms and physiology of patients, making the process of clinical trials more efficient. On the equity, I would say one of the things that, of course, is very front and center for us in pharma is clinical trial diversity. And we're all making great efforts and progress there, but it's not enough. And that might create an opportunity for more of a national campaign to bring awareness into underserved communities about the benefits of participating in clinical trial research. I can tell you, if you sign up for a clinical trial, you are going to get A+, grade A clinical treatment throughout your journey, because we want you to be pristine data for our studies without any noise in the system because you didn't get the care you needed. So I think there's a real opportunity there. And then finally, on fostering medical innovation, I would say preserve buy dole. That has allowed us our country to take innovations out of universities, patent them and license them so they can get on the path to product development, maintain the strength of the USPTO, do not weaken it. Without intellectual property, you will not attract investment capital, and look for more creative ways to fund things. I'm glad somebody mentioned philanthropy, because that is unique to the United States. And maybe one of the reasons is because we're the only country that actually allows you to deduct philanthropic donations from your taxes. If you wanted to further catalyze it, maybe give a 2-to-1 deduction if you're investing in biomedical research. And then other things could be done. For example, at Johnson & Johnson 10 years ago, we piloted a concept of biotech incubators, facilities where a company could come in, rent a bench, fully equipped, fully stocked. Over the last 10 years, J&J's J-Lab, all of them, have rise to 1,000 companies that have attracted more than $100 billion in investment capital. More of these types of creative ways of funding that valley of death, as referred to get things out of an academic lab and on the path to product development would be, I think, a step in that direction. So applaud all the elements of the proposal.
Wow. Well, certainly you've jumped right into many of the questions we'll be talking about, but thank you. And maybe I can just ask Bob to just have a 1 or 2 minute, because I do want to get into this whole co-funding issue, the national strategy, the workforce, in a little more depth. So, Bob? You are muted.
Sorry about that. So I'll make it unanimous with respect to the importance of the report, what it calls for, and why it's needed. We've been 80 years with a single model, and we really need to change. We've grown enormously, and we haven't changed to make the system efficient. Therefore, it's inefficient. I want to make sure that everybody remains cognizant of what I call the primary upstream drivers. And John and others have mentioned philanthropy, and I have been very involved in that area recently. The federal government, of course. Business, of course. John just pointed out the numbers. But very significantly, foundations, and in the area of biomedical and health, different from the other sciences, there are the charities, American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, the disease-oriented groups, all of whom contribute. And you don't find that in other areas of science. I'm a physicist by training, and an engineer, so you can see the difference. And I want to point out something that's just been mentioned, but it was one of the things we sort of uncovered about 5 years ago. And that is the unique role of philanthropy in the United States. I wrote a paper in 2021 effectively arguing that it's America's unique advantage. Nobody else has got it. And what's the scale of it? We just finished the study, which is why I think Al asked me to be on this group. $22 billion a year in fiscal year 2022 came from philanthropy within the basic research enterprise of the United States. The federal government in that same year spent $55 billion. So philanthropy, both current philanthropy and what I call legacy philanthropy, that is the payout from the endowments that the universities tend to choose to spend on themselves, and med schools got endowments too. That adds up to $22 billion as of FY 2022. So it's 40%. And a final comment about it, if you look at the last decade or more, federal funding for overall science in the United States has been flat in real terms, but has grown in real terms. And the growth has been due to the enhancement of the total by the giving from philanthropy, charities, foundations, individuals, and so on. So in framing your approach forward, my plea is to bear in mind the powerful role of the various primary drivers. Yes, the federal government, of course. Yes, business. But philanthropy is much larger than anybody actually realizes. So that would be my primary input. I've got other comments I'd like to make, but I'll stop there in light of the time that we'd like to have for conversation.
Thank you, Bob. And if you think about the wealth of this country and the ability to tap more contribution philanthropy, we're only scratching the surface. So your numbers will be much bigger. We're effective in bringing everybody in. And you started the Science Alliance, Philanthropy Alliance. I mean, that's the whole idea. So let me jump right in and maybe bundle the first two questions together then, because it's very clear that everybody's saying we need to have a much stronger vision. And, you know, if you talk about co-funding, everybody has to agree what that vision is to begin with, right? So my first question, and bundle with the second question, is, well, are we ready? Do you think it's a good idea to have such a advisory body, coordinating body, and who should be in it? And then bundling the second question, if you want to increase the funding, one of the ideas to say, let's have all sectors together to co-invest in important areas. I frequently look at Horizon Europe as a great example, where they really have not only European Union, but industry, and I think to some extent philanthropy to co-prioritize what they want to do, to be able to track what the outcomes are. And you saw L's slide, there's tremendous, or it's an earlier slide, there's tremendous increase in their output and success. So let me ask those two questions. You may want to decouple them, you want to put them together. Maybe I can start again with Monica. The idea of having such a body that is national across all different disciplines, agencies, and industry and philanthropy to create a body that's strategic to go forward about what's needed, as Elliot said, in planning about where to invest, how much to invest over, say, every 5 years. And then let me come back to the issue of how to put that money together. Monica?
Yes, thank you, Victor. So let me tell you why I think that would give us tremendous opportunities to leverage. And here, we at NIH, $47 billion in funding last year. That comes from the federal government. These are taxpayer dollars. We are very aware constantly that we could spend those dollars 10 times over very easily with the ideas that rush in from our amazing scientific enterprise. But where do we focus? We constantly talk about focusing our spending on the areas that aren't covered by anyone else. That's what leveraging means. So what is our focus? One's already been described: curiosity-driven discovery research. That takes more than 50% of our budget because it's not strongly covered by any other area. But could it be in the future? Perhaps, if we coordinated better. Number two, health disparities. Also not an area we've seen covered by other entities, other than perhaps philanthropy, I think becoming more actively involved there. Another, rare diseases. And I'm talking about the ultra rare, but increasingly even expanding beyond that. Next, preventive care, early disease detection, preventive care, screening. And then last of all, I'll mention another priority area: expansion of therapies beyond a primary indication for regulatory approval. NIH has long been the primary funder of curative adjuvant expansion to adjuvant therapies, for example, in cancer, that really haven't been covered so much by the pharmaceutical industry. Let me just end by saying that I've given a bunch of categories that are our area of focus, but I think were we to have a body where we could coordinate better the boundaries where we all work, philanthropy, the private sector, and philanthropy and private sector could be much more porous than they are, to the benefit of.
Yeah, so that clearly is a coordinated function that says, look, I fund more of this, you fund more of that. Let's coordinate and make sure there's a continuum so that the work done in discovery moves all the way to equity, access, population, new commercialization, et cetera. So that's important. But I also think we need strategic vision too, right? Besides coordination. So therefore, let me turn to John. I think the question is, looking strategically, pharma industry look at what the product output is and eventually what the market allows them to actually move forward. But you may want to say, hey, wait a minute, that's our strategy, but for the health of the nation, there should be a larger body looking at number of years of where to invest. For example, you mentioned some areas that should be co-invested, right? You talk a lot about the interface between AI and medicine, things like that. That's strategic. By the way, I serve on the Prime Minister's Council in Singapore on this, and clearly these are some areas they say strategic investing, where it need to be, where versus a coordinating function. So what's your reaction about that?
No, I think there's an opportunity to perhaps take that to a next level. As you know, I would say certainly these public-private partnerships that have led to investment have certainly been helpful for areas of disease biology. There's the NIH programs that we all know about. There's the Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe, where there's co-funding. But my thought was that if you have broadly enabling technologies that can allow the whole process of discovering, designing, and developing therapeutics work more efficiently, more cost effectively, let's not forget that still to this date, only 8% of molecules that get put in the clinic actually become a medicine. And that doesn't count all the failures that happen in the laboratory in the preclinical space. So we still have a very inefficient process. Elias pointed that out. So the more we can invest in enabling technologies then that enable that process to be more fruitful, less trial and error, then I think the better the whole ecosystem is, and the more that we can translate great discoveries from academic institutions ultimately to medicinal products that help patients to have better outcomes.
Yeah. So let me ask Bob this question then. Bob, I feel that with the power of philanthropy, the power industry, the power of government funding, if they come together and together prioritize areas, and as pointed out by Monica, coordinate, strategize how those areas, right? So philanthropy, at least, has a history of saying, I am a donor, I'd like to study this area or that area, versus coming together with others to say, you know what, actually, if we pull our resources together, we can move even faster. What do you think about that approach, this so-called new models of financing Elias talked about?
Right. Well, before I comment on that, Victor, and I will, I just want to mention about the vision and the nature of the advisory group that you are recommending that would be uber everything else. And if you have that in mind, I think one thing to ask yourself is, should you be asking Congress for congressional authorization of such a group? Because the power of the group is going to come not only from its advice as to how to coordinate the business as a whole, but then how do you make the case to Congress for funding? Those are inseparable. And so thinking about how you would connect it is a pretty fundamental piece.
Very wise words, very wise words. Thank you.
With respect to the collaborative, absolutely. I wanted to give you an example. So collaborative means that sometimes initiatives actually come from places you don't expect, and philanthropy is one of them. The first grand challenge problem of the 21st century was the BRAIN initiative announced in 2013 by President Obama. Where did that come from? It came initially from a meeting funded by 3 philanthropies on what is the opportunities at the intersection of nanoscience and neuroscience. That was held in September of 2011. And we cavally backed the scientists who had the idea, could we map the functioning brain? Crazy, far out, very difficult. But they had an idea. We funded a white paper. The white paper went to NIH and NSF and DOE. They all came together slowly, but not so slowly. From September of 2011, we were in the East Room of the White House in April of 2013 with President Obama announcing the BRAIN initiative. $10 billion, $5 billion over 10 years. And where was the partnership? It not only got catalyzed by philanthropy, but then the government asked some of us, would we contribute? Would we partner with the government? Kavli put up $40 million. HHMI put up $100 million. The Allen Institutes in Seattle put up another $100 million. So there was significant private philanthropic funding matching. That's the model.
Yeah. Terrific. And I'm very excited that I think overall, all of you feel this is a good direction to go. Obviously, there's a lot of details worked out, but you've given the brain initiative as a very good example of people coming together. So I think a big issue that was discussed today is the outcomes are not quite as good. And it's attributed to disparities, equity issue. Cameron, I mean, you do a lot of cancer work. You think about those issues. And I think the question here is, since we're talking about research, what kind of investment do we need to make in addressing this issue of equity and outcomes?
Yeah. So first, I think it's really important that that was called out as one of the major points of this report. I do want to say, in regards to should there be a large panel that provides this advisory inputs, I think that we all know that our voices are louder when we speak together, and so that's where I think the real power is. And that can touch on a lot of different things. And you asked about health equity, you know, a body like that being able to say, this has to be a priority. So I see health equity as a priority for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it's the right thing to do. So that's, you know, in moral terms, very, very clear. But it's also oftentimes the low-hanging fruit. It's the place where you can make some of the biggest gains by bringing assets to places that just have never had that opportunity. And I think that a convening like this can elevate where there's great opportunities. So, and that goes back to touching on all of the different components that you just talked about. So, you know, regaining trust and building the transparency and being very clear about what it is and why we're doing it, where the research is having benefit, and making sure that it's reaching all people. The opportunity to touch education and STEM education in particular, I think is so vitally important. And that also gets to health equity, because we need to reach all of that parts of the workforce. And then we heard about some discussion about clinical trials. You know, that's a place where we're putting a lot of effort today. In addition to understanding the biology of cancers in all populations, it's getting our clinical studies and our clinical discoveries into the broadest possible distribution. And so distributed clinical trial design, you know, the opportunity to advocate for different models of how we support clinical research, that's where we'll really be able to empower our country to do the kinds of work that we want to see happen.
Yeah, thank you. You know, already Monica's done things like Care for Health, and obviously the All of Us program is very much into looking at diversity and community, right? So that's the direction we talk about going. But Monica, you want to say what about how you see this from NIH? Then I want to go to Bob, talk about to John, talk about access.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of led with our U.S. healthcare system as a kind of framer for some of this, because if you look at the map, you look at where the disparities are. Zip code is a big driver of disparities, even independent of a lot of the other factors. And it's the same map if you say, where are we not doing research? And why are we not doing research? Because there's not a health system. There's not been the previous investment in those regions that have allowed research to blossom and care to happen effectively, access to care to happen effectively. So I do think the one other thing we have to consider is, again, we're about health, and especially in the realm of disparities, we also have to deal with the issues of access and care delivery.
Yeah, thank you. And John, I know you talk a lot about access, right? And so I think in question in your industry, how do you make sure that you enhance access? Particularly since, number one, I guess you can say what Cameron and Monica is totally aligned with you doing, which is want to get to community. But I think there's also issue of, let's face it, price and other things. So can you help me a little bit think about how we can reach this kind of last mile?
Yeah, it's somebody referenced how complicated the U.S. healthcare system is, and I certainly echo that. And I think probably all pharma companies give away hundreds of millions in free drugs to communities that can't afford to pay for them. But fundamentally, we have some differences in our reimbursement system that exists in no other country. And I think figuring this out for prescription drugs in particular, I'll set aside med device and diagnostics for now, is particularly important because, while prescription drugs in this country and most developed drug nations is about 20% of the healthcare costs, it is often the best hedge against keeping people out of hospitals, against needing surgery, against needing expensive procedures. So a very critical piece. The two things that really set aside our system in this country is the middlemen. Today, the average pharmaceutical company only sees 40 cents on the dollar of the cost of the medicines that we manufacture and distribute. 60 cents on the dollar on average goes to middlemen, mostly pharmacy benefit managers, insurance companies, who take none of the risk, who contribute zero to the innovation. The other is we have a highly litigious system in medicine in our country that exists in no other, where quite easily, even for companies that have been completely compliant and diligent about developing their products, can be attacked by lawsuits that run hundreds of millions, even billions, in a legal system that exists in no other country but in the United States. So I think those are part of the solution for how we can reduce the real out-of-pocket and real costs to patients in this country, addressing what is truly something unique to our nation.
Yeah, so I think all of you, Monica started saying this, and you do, that we have a healthcare system and maybe a health insurance system that doesn't quite work and it's creating this kind of disparities and WAP issues altogether. So when we say this is about the research enterprise, I think we need to understand that research and system go hand in hand. And unless we do things that about research that drive policy to changes. So one area that I think this report may not have emphasized enough is to talk about research policy. Having a lot more scientists interested in using evidence-informed policy to start really making differences there, right? That leads me perfect to the workforce issue. And let me talk to Bob first, because I know Bob had a lot of thoughts about research about workforce, and he noted his observation about time taken, etc. But Bob, talk a little bit about the workforce issue, and I do want to come back to the report, the issue of diversity, right? We talk about international workforce, but US, we have also a lot of lack of diversity in workforce. So let's bundle this conversation together. Anyone can put up their hand.
Okay, so you asked me to comment about the performers.
Yeah.
If you think about who the performers are of the system, they fall into basically three categories: the basic scientist, the physician scientist, and the clinician scientist. There's also the postdocs and the graduate students. I would say absolutely on your recommendation, by the way, about postdocs, both to pay them more and make them permanent employees. That's a crucial recommendation, and I hope it'll get implemented. But on the members who carry out the business, the performers of the work, the categories are different from any other field of science. And the risk that these different categories of people are willing to take with respect to the problems they'll attack also varies in a very different way. The basic scientists within the system tend to take the risks that are taken by others. I have a great new idea. How do I figure out how it could make a difference. And sometimes philanthropy will take a higher risk. So I want to mention just briefly, ensure as you do this whole enterprise of reorganization, that risk is top of mind. And the willingness to take risk and to fund risk is really quite crucial. If you look at your three categories, the clinical scientists in the system often get support from grateful patients. The clinical scientists are not necessarily the best scientists. They're often surgeons. They're often have other capabilities, and they're great at that. So there's no knocking it. But that doesn't translate into being a great researcher, particularly at the fundamental level. And so the other characteristic, and this is about workforce, is that they're in need of supporting their total salary. And so unlike in physics, chemistry, engineering, and other areas where the academic year support, particularly for the academics, is provided by the university in general, physician scientists have to get that support from outside. That limits the risk they're willing to take in making proposals, because they've got to be sure they get that grant to support themselves, not only their group. So taking account this spectrum of players within the performing community in the biomedical area strikes me as a critical issue for this national strategy, and then for people who are working at various levels within it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for your insights. I agree with almost everything except that you talk about whether surgeons and cardiologists are good scientists. I think they're great scientists in their domain of what they do, not discovery per se. I would look at Kimran and Monica as examples, or John for that matter. Let me now open the for public Q&A, and I would say this question be directed to anyone, to the members of authoring group, the committee, to the panelists. And let me just turn to Laura and maybe pick some questions and direct to any of our people in this Zoom meeting altogether.
Thank you. The first question is, I didn't see or hear much today about international collaboration, which is a critical part of the American biomedical research enterprise. For example, much of what we know about preventing and treating HIV infection. What is the role of international partnerships in advancing health research? And a related question, has there been consideration of global collaboration with other global funders to advance health science innovations of common importance?
Great question. Elias, may I ask you to address that? And I see Kimran's hand up and Monica as well.
Yeah, it may not have been mentioned in the report. It is in the body of it. We do talk about international collaboration. There are two areas. There's the area that is absolutely required, pandemic surveillance, collaboration on working on infectious agents, global health. It's happening daily. Monica can tell you the NIH invests a tremendous amount of money overseas. We're probably the larger funder than people think about European and non-African research, research in India and so on. So no, that will continue. It needs to continue for what I would call tactical reasons that relate to the fact that diseases know no frontiers. The second one is a little different. I mean, this notion of global collaboration for common purposes and common goals. That is a very different beast, if you will. Why? Because there is no urgency to it. There's not a pandemic risk. And that is the most difficult part, especially in the geopolitical environment that is being increasingly fractured. I tried this with the European Union. John was at the IMI, and we try to coordinate between the IMI, EMA, FDA, and NIH. Very difficult to do that sort of global collaboration, especially that one of the responses I received is that you, the Americans, are unpredictable. Your agencies do whatever they want, and your Congress funds or doesn't fund. If we have a global collaboration, it's subject to congressional funding or stopping the funding, which has happened also. And so this is a topic that I think whoever is asking that question is putting the finger on something important. There is international collaboration, but strategic global collaboration needs to be driven by a vision forward, not just by day-to-day, year-to-year vagaries of funding.
Right.
That's why the Gates Foundation can do it better than we can.
Yeah,
because consistent funding over long periods of time.
Right. That feeds into the first two recommendations that you talked about, which is strategic, long-term, or stable, and therefore enabled to move forward with programs. Cameron, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say that with regard to collaborations internationally, these diseases are not unique to our country, so that kind of work will and has to continue. I see this advisory body potentially helping to justify, educate, and leverage the ability to do more of that. A couple of really great examples. We partner with Cancer Research UK on the Cancer Grand Challenges. The ability to put together really big teams is something that really moves to a big worldwide type of effort. And then, as we talk about philanthropy and being able to really leverage philanthropy, not for the individual niche projects that things might go to, but actually for big, bold initiatives, maybe for rare diseases as well as things that are burning issues. That's where there's real power to move together. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Laura, take another question.
Sure. Where do payers fit into the equation?
Aha.
Multiple examples of effective new products failing in the marketplace due to lack of reimbursement exist already.
Yeah, this is a central question, right? We're talking about the system itself, payer being an important part of the system. Let me get a few reactions to it. Anyone? Maybe asking Sidip or Al or Ann, and you guys want to talk anything about this?
Well, we do have one example in the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which in the ACA is able to review the evidence and make recommendations about the strengths of a particular preventive approach or screening tool, et cetera. And if it's an ARB recommendation, it is meant to be covered by insurers. So that is one small example of a mechanism, but certainly the bigger issues are some difficulties in the marketplace.
I'd like to follow up on what Ann just said. And one of the problems, I think Monica made the comment, and John did as well, and that's we got a very complicated system, healthcare system. And I say that only because there's some groups are covered based on their jobs. And there's others who are not covered. And there's some who are covered with Medicaid or Medicare or private insurance. So because of the rubric of coverage that we have, this is an area I would say that needs work. We cannot be complacent and say we have a totally satisfactory system. It's such a tiered system. As a consequence, some will always fall between the cracks, and that's very, very difficult. In terms of, as a clinician scientist, for example, you do see people who, in fact, they need care, but because of the insurance type, are unable to get the care that they need. So it's a complicated system that I think I would put it in the category of an area that needs attention because it is not sufficiently robust to cover the needs of our population.
Sidip, did you want to come in?
I'll say something. I know Monica had her hand up too, and I'd love to hear from her. But let me just say one thing, which is that the connection between the payer and the biomedical research enterprise is so different than any other research enterprise. So if you think in terms of products, if you think in terms of military technology, the user, usually the payer, is much more closely aligned with the research enterprise. They say, hey, the biggest impact could come from a thing here, a widget here that changes the productivity, the efficiency of our or the customer appreciation for our product. In the healthcare world, we don't do that because we're, as scientists, we're chasing scientific opportunity and research opportunity, as we should. But the challenge becomes, how does that relate to payers? How does it relate to reducing the cost of healthcare, having the biggest impact on health of broader populations? There is no conversation happening there, and there probably should be.
Yeah. Monica.
So this has been done for the field of oncology, and it's been done for the field of cardiology. The results are almost the same. This being that if you look at guidelines, recommendations that are used to guide treatment decisions for patients, only 7% of those guideline decisions are based on the highest level of evidence. The rest are based on evidence that can be very fallible. One of the biggest things we can possibly do to try to rein in healthcare costs and deliver better outcomes to people is truly get a handle on the relationship between care delivered and real outcomes. And I think we're all working really hard on building the kind of system that will allow us to do. You know, one of the advantages of being part of the US government is we have probably the biggest payer right there with us working on this. And this is one of the cross-government activities that I think you'll see more research focused on soon.
Now, this is really excellent because I'm thinking food is medicine, right? So what's happening there? That's a great example because for a long time, you know, we know that the UDGP says if you do lifestyle, you can actually get even better outcome than drugs, and yet took 15 years for insurance companies to say, okay, we cover it. Now there's a movement, NIH and others, to say, let's get evidence that food, lifestyle, etc., can improve health, whereby insurance company will put in coverage to those activities. So that's where research and policy and payment are aligned. I think this is what this report needs to say a little bit more. And this, in fact, in the last mile discussion, is to say you really need these sciences to come together to provide evidence where there's savings for the insurance company. That's better outcome. So let's do it. And I think our research have not done enough of those things, in my opinion, right? I also want to come back to the issue of policy. I really think scientists should not only go into science diplomacy, but policy, because it's understanding how policy is being made is when you change your way of doing your research to enable you get the data to inform policy. So we can take another question.
Okay, this is a set of 3 related questions. The report discusses trust in the research enterprise. An element of engendering trust must include increased literacy about health and the research enterprise. How do we do this? The related questions are, what might be the role of community engagement in research? And how do we generate the political and public interest that is required to support an overarching strategic plan?
And may I ask you to take this on?
Did you say me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think trust and community engagement.
Yeah. Now, we know how crucial it is both to make or break the use of any interventions in addressing health crises. And so one aspect of doing more community engaged research would be to fund it, to make it a part of sort of a mixed methods approach as part of the whole research life cycle of producing new medications and interventions. So I think that's one element is being able to prioritize it as an integral part of the research that we do.
Yeah, I think, Monica, maybe you ought to tell me about your Care for Health. What are you trying to do exactly this issue?
So if you ask people who do they trust for anything to do with their health, first on the list is their primary care clinician. Second on the list is their pharmacist. Third on the list are friends and family. Bottom on the list is government, okay? So our approach is to say, especially for these communities that are experiencing real severe healthcare disparities, we want to make it possible for the primary care clinician to be able to do research, Two things that will do. First, it will elevate the quality of care that they are able to deliver by bringing research dollars in there. And, as John has already described, we know that research, if it's done properly and resourced properly, helps deliver better care. And number two, it is going to bring trust into some of the very communities that, first of all, are suffering the most, and second of all, we know have the least trust in our system overall.
Bob, I'm thinking about Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and how they've been driving areas like this and research in this area, right? They're pushing deep into equity research. They're re-looking at how research is being done. They do co-production with community and lived experience. I think philanthropy can do a lot. And I think some of the philanthropy, your peers are doing a lot, like RWJ, the Ford Foundation, and many others.
Oh, indeed. And I would also point out, while philanthropy in the United States is far and away larger than any other place, the Wellcome Trust, as an example of somebody outside the United States, has an enormous impact. So has the Howard Hughes Medical Institute here within the United States. And, just to give you and the audience a sense of the scale at which those foundations operate, the endowment of the Wellcome Trust is north of $30 billion. And the endowment of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute is north of $20 billion. So between the two of them, it's almost $55 to $60 billion endowment, of which they spend about 5% a year on health. And that's an enormous contributor to the system. So in many ways, Victor, you're right. And that's just to give an example of scale that might surprise some in the audience.
I say that scale has influence. And some of the foundations you mentioned are saying, the question was asked of Monica and Anne and Kimran, how are you going to get community engagement? How are you going to do equity? I think they can leverage their strength in pushing the changes, which we see. Well, I think we run out of time. I do want Elle to close the meeting, but let me say a few words. I mean, I'm so grateful to Elle and the entire group who wrote this report. They spent over a year doing this. As you heard from our panelists, there's really almost unanimity to say they did the right things. In this discussion, we still feel there's some gaps that we need to put in further into maybe around the same blocks, but a deeper dive into some of the issues related to some of the things we talk about. So there's a lot of work to be done. Let me look at all of you, starting with Monica, NIH, Kimran, NCI, John, Industry, Bob, Philanthropy. We want to work with all of you. And NAM is here to stand by to work with you. And I look at CDIP, AAAS, and of course, all others, Anne and Elias. I think we're all in this together. So I hope that this publication is the foundation and catalyst for a lot more conversation and action going forward. It will take some, shall we say, political will and boldness to see all this being executed. We look forward to working with you. Elle, may I ask you to close the meeting?
Thanks, Victor. Let me just say just a few points. As I reflect on this meeting, it sort of reminds me of doing a laboratory experiment. You've designed it well, as far as you're concerned. You've executed it well, as far as you're concerned. But then you have to leave it overnight to incubate, or maybe 2 days. You're not sure exactly what's going to happen in a day or two. But when whatever it is truly comes out well, it's a euphoric feeling. Likewise, the group, the committee, many of whom are not here, but hopefully are watching. We spent over a year talking among ourselves, analyzing data. Elias and Sudip, arguing among ourselves, which is good, healthy conversation, and wrestling, and creating these recommendations based on the findings that we thought would be most impactful. And it's extraordinarily gratifying and exciting to not only be able to put it together, but to get the kind of feedback, as Victor said, the kind of endorsement, the affirmation that we're getting from our colleagues. So we believe that this is a beautiful time. I think Bob said it, it's 80 years with our system. And now we're proposing not a complete recasting, but an upgrading, a reinvigoration, a reimagining of our system to enhance it. And I think that what I would say as Victor, we hope that we can continue to work with you or call upon each of you to give input as we go forward. But this, I think, is a report that gives us, my colleagues and I, great joy in having come to this point. I want to thank the entire committee, those who are on the screen and those who are at home or at work or wherever they are at the beach. Thank them for their great input, great insights. Thank the colleagues who have joined the so-called reactors for the time they have spent in really giving us incredible insight. And the audience who have sat through and listened and given questions that Laura read to us. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your support and thank you for your engagement, and more to come. Thank you all for being with us.